Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. On this episode, we're discovering the dramatic political thriller unfolding in Romania. It's a story of cyber attacks, foreign interference, and a TikTok campaign that makes you question everything about democracy. Democracy in the digital age isn't just fair game, it is a battleground. And Romania just found itself right in the middle of it. On the 1st of December, Romanians went to the polls to elect their parliament. While voters debated who could fix issues like economic stagnation and corruption, a foreign state actor was busy launching cyber attacks, spreading disinformation, and manipulating social media algorithms. But before we go any further, let's take a look at our report to find out more details of the story.
Romania was shaken by the first round of its presidential elections. Headlines similar to those from many other recent European elections peppered the country's press. And soon, on Sunday, Romanians will be back in queues like these. The final part of this year's wild election season in Romania, involving both parliamentary and presidential votes, will conclude on December 8th. Călin Georgescu, a far-right and pro-Russian independent, took his country's political scene by storm. Elevated by a powerful social media campaign, accused of having ties to Russia, he won the first round and continues to run a NATO and West skeptic platform.
The concern of the Romanian people is to be happy. It cannot be happy spending money on other things. If NATO is defensive, as it is said, then it should remain defensive.
His opponent will be Alina Lasconi, a pro-EU and pro-West candidate who came second in the first round. In contrast, she wants a much more European future for her country and for her people.
I expect us to continue to remain on the European and Euro-Atlantic line, and I expect as many people to come out to vote as possible.
Many Romanians have taken to the streets between the votes to voice their disapproval of Georgescu's program, setting the stage for the upcoming vote to be a showdown between Western values and so-called Putinism.
And now we're zooming in on Bucharest to take a look at the issue in greater detail. The Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has blown the whistle, revealing documents that expose a sophisticated meddling campaign designed to tip the scales of their presidential election. And if your first guess is Russia, then congratulations! You've played Eastern geopolitics bingo before. According to Romania's intelligence services, the interference was no small fry. It was a coordinated campaign with organized cyber attacks on electoral systems, shady money funneled into political campaigns, and a massive propaganda blitz across TikTok. This platform, known for dance challenges, viral recipes, and now apparently undermining democratic institutions, is at the very center of this story, and Orwell is really face-palming in his grave right now. One of the key players in this TikTok circus is Călin Georgescu, a nationalist candidate who, until very recently, was a relatively unknown figure, certainly abroad. Suddenly, his campaign received €1 million in financing, coincidentally timed with a surge of TikTok content promoting his platform. Behind the scenes, over 25,000 accounts, coordinated through Telegram and Discord, pumping out propaganda like it's a Black Friday sale on disinformation. And to sweeten the pot, over 100 influencers with a combined following of 8 million jumped on the Georgescu bandwagon all of a sudden. This raises a chilling question. How much influence can you buy for the price of a luxury yacht? Apparently enough to potentially swing an election. And while Romania wrestles with its newfound TikTok trauma, the political landscape itself is beginning to shift. Last week's parliamentary elections have left Romania's major parties, PSD and PNL, scrambling to save face after significant losses. Meanwhile, nationalist and extremist parties have surged in popularity, feeding off voter frustration with the status quo. This isn't just a Romanian phenomenon either, it's a pattern we've come to see play out across Europe. When mainstream parties fail to deliver, voters gravitate towards anyone promising dramatic change. On the presidential front, it's a head-to-head between Alina Lasconi, a moderate with a Euro-Atlantic outlook, and the TikTok darling, Georgescu. Lasconi's challenge is Herculean in nature. She needs to unite Romania's fractured political middle ground to stop Georgescu from steering the country into nationalist isolation. And with the second round just days away, every single vote counts. So, where does this leave Romania? In a precarious spot, to say the least. The revelation of foreign interference highlights vulnerabilities in the country's democratic processes, vulnerabilities that extend far beyond its borders. What happens to Romania isn't just a Romanian problem. It's a test case for how democracies can or can't defend themselves in the digital age. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Alexandra Iancu, Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of Bucharest. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, the election fever in Romania is in full swing. We actually have the second round of presidential elections coming up. We also have initial results of the parliamentary elections. So, let's begin with the latter. How is the coalition likely to look like following these elections? Because according to what we know, the parliament itself may be more fragmented than ever before, at least since the 1990s.
Not 1990s or 1996, but it's true that the Romanian political system was about to stabilize. And for the first time, we have 7 parties in parliament. And we assisted at a major process of the alignment, that being the electorate just left the traditional parties to go toward newer, smaller, let's call it so, radical right parties. So what is happening right now, before the second round of presidential election, is that the major leaders of the pro-European political parties are trying to come up with a coalition. So they reach an agreement. So most likely we are going to have all these parties, 4 parties in parliament, that are going to form a governmental coalition after the elections.
And what impact will it have on the presidential elections? Is it, as simple as to say, okay, so if these parties have a majority, taken together, they are like 70% versus 30% when it comes to far-right parties, of which there are 3, one of them the largest one, AUR, and 2 smaller ones. But according to some of the polls, Georgescu may still win that. So why doesn't this translate quite as simply from the parliamentary elections to the polls for the second round of presidential vote?
That's quite extraordinary. What we have had on the first round of elections is that those that actually represented the main parties did not actually go in the second round of presidential elections. So Georgescu is an independent, is not, or at least he presents himself as being an independent. And although he had some backing, it was from a very small radical right party. Lasconi, in her turn, she is representative of a pro-European party, but is not the largest one. So what is happening is that people voted differently in the presidential race because basically they like better the contenders. Whereas in the parliamentary elections, we have had a vote that was mostly structured around traditional parties or political parties in general. And in the case of parliamentary elections, of course, the fact that parties have had local organizations that were strongly mobilized, that played to the advantage of basically maintaining a large pro-European coalition in parliament.
So let's address the elephant in the room, political interference. We already have heard warnings coming in from various sources, even the initial results. I mean, a candidate just emerging out of the blue, all of a sudden taking the lead and right now leading in the polls. I mean, this does not happen by accident. And many said, well, this could not have been organic. But now we have a stark warning from the United States, Antony Blinken, suggesting that, well, you actually have a major election interference operation going on in your country. So the big question is, what is going to be done about this? Because if democracy is simply like, like a car left out in the street, in one of these good neighborhoods, when you don't lock up your front door and you leave your keys in the car, you cannot actually be angry if your car gets stolen. But this is what's happening. I mean, someone is trying to steal the car and we say, well, this is the way things are. My question is something going to be done about this? If we do know that there has been what may amount to an outright hijacking of the democratic system in Romania?
There are going to be investigations. We knew that something was off referring to these elections because Georgescu has had in the polls like less than 1% at the beginning of the electoral campaign. And then he came in first with 22, almost 23% of the vote. So it was quite unexpected. And you cannot explain that only based on the spiral of silence. And we know that the Romanian presidency actually declassified some reports from our intelligence services that are pointing to the fact that there have been foreign interventions, cyber attacks on the electoral process, although there are no proof that changed the electoral outcome. But what we do know is that in terms of national regulation, national electoral regulations, and the use of TikTok, it is clear that Călin Georgescu actually did not comply to internal regulations. For instance, he declared that he spent €0 for this electoral campaign. Or it is quite obvious that he had like numerous accounts of TikTok. He had had an agency that was endorsing his campaign. He also he used TikTok without actually specifying that is electoral advertising month, and actually also had various ways to try to use the algorithms in his favor. So he's not like this individual that is at home, uses TikTok, and all of a sudden in 2 weeks he gets 20% of the vote. So
plenty of irregularities, right? Strongly suspicious situation. But the second round of the elections is still happening, even though we had red flags following the first round. So my question is this. If the second round happens, if Georgescu wins, using all those algorithms that he has managed to hijack, or perhaps that he was given access to in order to be able to slightly improve his position in these elections. And, I'm deliberately trying to frame it as an understatement, right? If he's allowed to win this, then, well, it's going to be an open and shut case. I mean, you cannot later on say, okay, so the elections must be annulled because there were irregularities, unless there are any provisions to do that. Doesn't that leave democracy defenseless, open to manipulation from the outside?
In principle, yes, but then it is an electoral process, and then you should investigate and have all the data. The problem was that, for instance, what happened in the first round took us by surprise. It's not like one day in advance we knew that there is this issue with TikTok. We had some glimpses of the fact that he declared zero expenses, but that was all.
Okay, but now we know. Now we know this.
Now we know, but there's a process and there are procedures, and actually you can, for instance, yes, cancel, do not validate the electoral results based on these reports, but that came after basically the process has started and the moment in which you could have actually contested the process. But you can still do it after the second round, or you can have larger investigations and then just suspend the president. I mean, Romania is a semi-presidential system, but it's not like the president cannot be dismissed or cannot be accused of various or indicted for that matter if it's a crucial question for democracy.
Well, exactly. How broad are these presidential powers? Because obviously some people might think, okay, so if he wins, not only is Romania going to be stuck with this guy, and he is openly pro-Russian. He said he's not going to be helping Ukraine, even with the grain trade. I'm not just talking about the weapons, because one could say, oh, this is a question of sovereignty. We can no longer afford to sell any weapons. But with the grain trade, what's the problem? So clearly a pro-Russian move. And now, if he becomes president, some people may fear that he will be able to influence influence, officially or unofficially, the entire process of the investigation, perhaps but by appointing loyalists to certain institutions. And it is going to simply be, bogged down in procedural, intricacies of some kind. Meaning that before we even get any sort of official result, months, perhaps years may pass, and even if we actually are able to prove that, the election was rigged from the outside, well, nothing can be done about this because we don't really have any means to do that, and the damage will have been done by that time.
Yes, I'm a little bit more optimistic as to the electoral results of the second round of elections in Romania still. Surveys have been known to be mistaken on these issues. However, in what concerns your questions, yes, we do know that this is a possibility, that being core packing or trying to appoint a new loyalist in crucial and key positions. But as I said, we still have a second round. We don't have the second round of elections that were validated by the Constitutional Court. So the elections will be over when the court will validate the second round of elections. And there are also institutional means to confine the power of the president. Paradoxically, in Romania, the power of the president is not as high. It is, however, highly influential informally. So, of course, that on a long run, it will be detrimental to the functioning, highly detrimental to the functioning of democracy. But all in all, from a procedural perspective, from an institutional perspective, he has few institutional incentives, if not backed by a parliamentary majority, if not backed by a major coalition. So in this way, the parliament is going to become a crucial actor in basically blocking the presidency. But let's hope that this is not going to be the situation after this Sunday.
And an optimistic outlook is still something that we, as you're saying, should take into account, because we've seen massive crowds on the streets in Bucharest and other cities protesting against pro-Russian candidate Mr. Georgescu and the parties that support him directly or indirectly. However, as we've seen, well, elections may actually be rather unpredictable, especially in these difficult times. So it's a wait-and-see kind of approach, at least for now. Alexandra Iancu was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Russia is reportedly keeping North Korean soldiers away from the combat zone in the Kursk region, according to the National Resistance Center run by the Ukrainian military. In November, Pyongyang deployed between 10 and 12,000 troops to help Russia in the war against Ukraine.
Russian forces have been committed to a major offensive in the Kursk region. Their goal is very likely to retake the territory before any peace negotiations can be held. Yet the North Korean soldiers stationed in Kursk are meant to help the Russians in a more indirect way. Instead of fighting on the front lines, leadership is keeping them at checkpoints and observation outposts. This has apparently freed up a significant number of Russian troops to be involved in more direct combat. Ukrainian President Zelensky believes that this first batch of North Korean soldiers are being treated well so that more will be attracted to join the conflict. In an interview with Kyodo News, he also revealed that the first troops sent from Pyongyang were killed in the war, though he did not say how many. North Korea's involvement in the war has set many observers on edge, including Ukrainian allies, as it is seen as a major escalation.
The chiefs of staff of the United States and Russia held a rare phone call amid the ongoing escalation in the war in Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, direct contact between Washington and Moscow has ceased.
The conversation between Valery Gerasimov and Charles Brown concerned several different global security issues. The call was held at the request of the Russian side. Syria was one of the call's most discussed topics in addition to Ukraine. Gerasimov said that Moscow was aiding its allies in Damascus with airstrikes against rebel forces. Brown, on the other hand, raised concerns about the involvement of North Korean troops in the war in Ukraine. The call took place as the conflict escalates into a new phase. Moscow has been less than pleased with US permission for Ukraine to use ATACMS to strike Russia's own territory. Over the last few weeks, Russia has been intensifying its attacks not only against Ukrainian forces, but also against critical infrastructure, aiming to cut thousands of Ukrainians off from power and other necessities.
New reports show that Ukraine isn't the only facing manpower issues in the war. Russian losses may soon begin to outpace enlistment rates, and apparently close to 50,000 of Moscow's troops are now missing in action.
The Russian government has been putting a lot of effort into its latest mobilization campaign. As the war in Ukraine escalates, the Russian army is in need of fresh bodies for the front. Yet, despite promises of bonuses and lucrative recruitment contracts, the Meduza news outlet says that recruitment has dropped in the current quarter compared to the last one. Mobilization is highly unpopular in Russia, especially among those living in cities. The conflict has had a very high casualty rate for both sides, and not many people are eager to lose their health or lives. In fact, the Russian Deputy Defense Minister slipped up and said that the ministry had received 48,000 applications for DNA tests from relatives seeking information about soldiers. This could mean that almost 50,000 troops are MIA. To make up for some of these losses, it seems that Russia has been illegally drafting Crimea's residents. Kiev says that some 5,500 people from Crimea were mobilized into the Russian army in 2024.
The situation in Georgia is becoming dire, as the country's government has been accused of using excessive force to quell the pro-EU protests. The European Union and the United States are ready to impose severe penalties on members of the ruling Georgian Dream Party.
Despite the threat of police crackdowns, Georgian protesters took to the streets for the 8th night in a row. The manner in which the Georgian police has responded to these demonstrations has drawn vast international attention. Already, many in the West have questioned the results of the country's parliamentary elections. The response, many observers say, is something out of an authoritarian state and not the hallmark of a future European Union member. The hand behind these actions is the Georgian dream. The streets of Tbilisi have turned into something more akin to small war zones as protesters and police clash night over night. Various EU members like the Baltic states have already sanctioned members of the Georgian government. A broader EU and even US response to the situation has also been hinted at.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.